Welcome everyone. So this is part 2 of the digestive system chapter. And so we are going to start now by going through each part of the digestive system in detail, talking about its anatomy and its physiology and histology where it's important. All right, so we're going to start in the mouth. Okay, so for the functions of the mouth, the digestive functions are obviously going to be ingestion, right? So actually eating and mastication, chewing the food. And then the mouth will also be involved in the initial parts of swallowing, all right? So deglutition. The mouth for the type of tissue is going to be keratinized, stratified, squamous, so that just provides extra protection against abrasion from the food you eat that hasn't yet been digested. All right, so some structures, and we'll just kind of point them out as we talk about them within the mouth. So let's start kind of the outside and work our way in. So the lips are referred to as labia. So that's the lips that forms the anterior boundary of the mouth. And so then they're connected to the gums by this structure here. All right, it's called the labial frenulum. All right, and so the labial frenulum is just a little piece of connective tissue that joins the lips to the gingiva, which is going to be the gums. All right, so the gingiva is the gums, and so the lips are connected to the gingiva by that labial frenulum. Okay, and so then as we move more posteriorly, you'll find the palate. All right, so all of this would be the palate. The more anterior part of the palate is going to be the hard palate. All right, that is going to be made of bone underneath that epithelial tissue. And then behind that, we'll have the soft palate. All right, so there's no bony structure underneath the soft palate. And then in the back of the throat, you have the uvula. So we've talked about the uvula a couple times with the respiratory system. The function of the uvula is to prevent food from moving up into the pharynx, all right? So it will, the nasopharynx, right? So it'll kind of close off that nasopharynx. The uvula actually also produces a very small amount of saliva, okay? And then we have on the inferior, all right, part of the mouth, we have the tongue. Okay, so the tongue is made up of a bunch of skeletal muscles, and it is covered in papillae, so a bunch of little bumps. And you should remember from A&P1 when you learned about taste, right? A lot of those bumps contain taste buds that are involved in taste, but it also helps to provide friction when you're moving food around in your mouth to chew it and form that bolus of food that you're then going to swallow. Okay, and so then the lingual frenulum here, all right, is going to connect. It's again another piece of connective tissue that connects the tongue to the base of the mouth, right, the floor of the mouth. That's the lingual frenulum. Okay, so that's the mouth and kind of all the structures involved in the mouth. So let's talk about the salivary glands, all right? So they're obviously going to be secreting into that mouth. And so with the salivary glands, there's two different types of secretions that can be made by the salivary glands. All right, so the first secretion is going to be a serous secretion, all right? We have a serous and a mucus secretion. So the serous secretion is going to be watery. All right, so it's very fluid, watery secretion. And then the mucus is going to be more thick secretion. Okay, and so the glands, all right, are also referred to as acini that produce each of these is going to look different. Okay, so the glands, the acini, that produce a serous secretion, they are going to have nuclei that are very round and kind of in the middle of the cell, all right? And so then they'll just secrete that serous saliva, that solution, into this lumen, and then from there it will move up this duct, all right? So this is going to be a duct. Both of those types of acini are connected to ducts because these are exocrine glands. All right, so the serous acini, the nuclei are nice and in the middle, versus the mucus acini, that nucleus is pressed off to the edge. And that's because this whole cell is going to be full of bubbles of mucus. All right, so they fill up the cell and they push that nucleus off to the edge. All right, so, but again, the same way, it will make mucus secreted into the middle, and then that will be sent up the duct. All right, and so an acinus, again, is just a cluster of cells that are secreting into a duct. Okay, and so the composition of saliva, right, whether it's serous or mucus, they all have a few things in common. So it's going to contain, saliva is going to contain water, right, lots of water, especially more so if it's serous. It's going to contain a bunch of ions and lysozyme, all right? And so that lysozyme, the function of the lysozyme is it's an antibiotic, right? So that's going to help reduce bacteria and help to clean the mouth. And then saliva also contains some digestive enzymes, right? Not a lot, but they're going to start to get that process of digestion started. Okay, so it will contain lingual lipase, all right? And so lipase is going to digest fats. All right, so fat digestion starts in the mouth with that lingual lipase, and it's just a little bit of it, right? So there's not a lot of fat digestion happening in the mouth. And then there's amylase, which is an enzyme that digests carbohydrates. All right, so the main function of the enzymes in saliva is to begin carbohydrate digestion, right? There's much more amylase than there is lingual lipase. And so we're going to start carbohydrate digestion in the mouth. Okay. Also in saliva, you're going to find some antibodies and that kind of thing, all right, in saliva. Okay, so let's talk about, there are 3 different salivary glands. Let's talk about where they're located and what they produce. All right, so the first one is the parotid gland. Okay, and so the way to remember what each of these produces is by how long their duct is. So the longer the duct, the more watery that saliva would need to be to easily travel through that long duct. And so the parotid gland has the longest duct. So the parotid gland sits on your jaw, right? It actually sits right on top of that masseter muscle on the back of your jaw, and it sends its duct through that muscle and then into the oral cavity. Okay, so it has a very long duct, and so it has a very serous saliva that is making. All right, and then we have kind of the polar opposite is going to be the sublingual duct, or the sublingual gland, which is right here. Okay, it sits at the base of the tongue, and then it just has these very short little ducts, right, that open up into the floor of the mouth. All right, so it has very short ducts, so it makes a mucus saliva, all right, because it doesn't have very far to travel. And then we have the submandibular gland here, all right, that sits kind of underneath the jaw, and it has kind of a moderate length duct, and so it actually makes a mixed saliva. So it's a mixture of serous and mucus secretion. Okay, so those are our 3 salivary glands, all right, and the type of secretion that they make. Okay, so let's move on to teeth. All right, so let's talk about the types of teeth first, and then we can look at the structure of a teeth after that. All right, so teeth, first of all, are fitted into bones, right? You know that. They sit in sockets called alveoli, or alveolar sockets, in the mandible and the maxilla, okay? And you have 2 sets of teeth throughout your life, right? So you have your primary, or a lot of times they're called baby teeth. There are 20 total baby teeth, and then you lose those baby teeth and get your permanent teeth, of which there are approximately 32 permanent teeth. Okay, and so the different types are incisors, which are going to function in cutting, right? So kind of like clipping things in food when you take a bite, right? So they cut things. But behind the incisors, you have canines. Whoops, just rewriting the word. Canines, their function is to tear food, right? Especially meat and that kind of thing, right? So tearing food. And then premolars and molars, these are the more back teeth. Their function is going to be grinding that food up, right? Crushing it, mechanically digesting it, and forming that bolus. Okay? So premolars and molars are going to grind. All right, so when we look at the structure of a single tooth itself, so kind of the shape of this would be more of a premolar molar shape of tooth. We have the part that is exposed above the gums here. This is called the crown of the tooth. All right, and then the part that is below the gums, all this down here, is called the root. All right, so we have the crown and the root, and then we have the gingiva. All right, those gums are going to be located here. Okay, and so then for the tooth, the outermost part of the tooth is called enamel. All right, and so the enamel, it would be kind of this white exterior on the tooth. It's very, very hard. It's actually one of the hardest substances in the body, and it's approximately the thickness of a dime. All right, so it's thicker than you might think, and it is very, very hard to provide protection to all those blood vessels and nerves that are inside of that tooth. Okay, and so then just inside of that, you have this layer of dentin. All right, and so dentin is kind of the interior portion of the tooth. It's very bone-like in its makeup. All right, so it's hard as well, not as hard as enamel, but it is hard, and it's protein rich. All right. And then inside of that, we have our pulp cavity, all right? So that would be here. And so that pulp cavity is going to contain some connective tissue, but it's also going to contain a lot of nerves and blood vessels and that kind of thing, all right? And so that's why if you have some sort of decay in your tooth and it reaches down past that dentin, then your tooth can really start to hurt because that decay has reached where all those nerves are located. All right, and so those nerves and blood vessels will extend down into these root canals here, all right? And then, of course, you can see the bone here that tooth is embedded in. All right, so the root canal, right, that's actually what happens if you get a root canal. What they're going to do is drill into your tooth, all right, and they're going to remove all of this material in here in that pulp cavity, the blood vessels, the nerves, right? They're going to take all of that out. And so then you can just put, kind of like a cap, a crown back on top of the tooth, and then that tooth you won't have to worry about the decay or anything like that because those nerves are gone. All right. Okay, so that's teeth. All right, so once you've chewed up your food, formed it into this bolus, all right, your tongue is going to push that bolus to the back of the mouth, all right? That's where it will enter the pharynx, okay? And so the pharynx we've talked about before with the respiratory system. It has three parts, all right? We have the nasopharynx, which is part of the respiratory system. It doesn't really function in digestion. Food should not be in that nasopharynx. Then we have the oropharynx, all right? And so the oropharynx is a passageway for food and air, all right? It contains stratified squamous, all right, for that reason, because food and air are moving through it. And it sits directly behind the oral cavity, right? So when you swallow a bolus, the first part of the pharynx that we'll encounter is going to be this oropharynx. All right, and so then that would be here, all right, oropharynx. And then we have the laryngopharynx, all right, so that would be here. So this is also a passageway for food and air. All right, and so it contains, that's where the epiglottis is located, right here. All right, and remember that epiglottis is going to fold over and cover that larynx, so food goes down into the esophagus and not into the larynx, your windpipe. All right, and so that's the pharynx. Okay, and so the pharynx is going to be really important for initiating that process of swallowing, all right, which we're going to talk about in a minute, how swallowing works. Okay, but before we do that, let's talk about the esophagus. Okay, so from the pharynx, food is going to move into the esophagus. All right, so the esophagus has two sphincters. Okay, so by definition, a sphincter is just an area with a thickened muscularis externa. All right, and so the esophagus has the lower esophageal sphincter. All right, so that would be down here. That's the lower esophageal sphincter, and it prevents backflow of all this juice and food being digested from the stomach, prevents it from being able to flow back up into the esophagus. All right, so that sphincter can close off and prevent backflow of food into the esophagus and stomach acid. And then there's the upper esophageal sphincter. All right, that's right here. Okay, and so the function of the upper esophageal sphincter is to prevent backflow into the pharynx, right? So that material can't get back up here into the pharynx. All right. Good. Okay, so those are the two sphincters. Let's talk about the esophageal hiatus. All right, so we can see the esophagus as food would move through it, right, downward. It would come down, and eventually it is going to pass through the diaphragm. All right, that point where it passes through the diaphragm is called the esophageal hiatus. All right, so the esophageal hiatus is where the esophagus moves through the diaphragm. Just below that, right, it will meet the stomach. Okay, so histology for the esophagus is interesting, right? So most of the epithelium, right, all the epithelium in the esophagus is going to be stratified squamous, because we're dealing with the bolus here that's really just the chewed up food. And as I'm sure you know, not all food gets chewed up very, very thoroughly. Sometimes you can swallow a bite of food and feel like, especially with like chips or something, you can feel it scratching your throat, right? So you want that stratified squamous there to protect the esophagus from food that might not be chewed that well. Okay, so and then underneath the mucosa, in that submucosa where you contain a lot of glands, usually there are esophageal glands. Okay, these glands are going to produce mucus to just help lubricate that esophagus and keep that bolus moving through. The esophagus also has longitudinal folds. Okay, and so the reason, right, and these are going to be folds that run, longitudinal means they run up and down like this, right, instead of being like folds, like rings like this. Okay, so they are longitudinal, and they're there so that as you swallow like a big bolus of food, your esophagus can expand, right? So they allow for expansion of the esophagus. Okay, so that's the submucosa, right? So those would be folds of the mucosa and submucosa that run lengthwise down the esophagus. All right, and then what's really interesting about the esophagus is that muscularis externa. Okay, so it's kind of divided into three different regions. The first third of the esophagus is skeletal muscle, all right? And it's skeletal muscle because you do have voluntary control over swallowing, all right? And so that first third allows for that. And then the second third is kind of a mix between skeletal and smooth muscle. And then eventually you transition to just smooth muscle in that last third. all right, because that kind of the process of peristalsis would be taking over by that point and moving that food forward. Okay, good. And so the last topic for this chapter is going to be swallowing and the physiology of swallowing, right? The steps of swallowing. Okay, so this process is controlled by the swallowing centers in the medulla and the pons. Okay, so in the brain stem, that's where your swallowing centers are located. And it occurs in 3 phases. All right, so we have the first phase, which is the buccal phase, right? So buccal refers to kind of your cheeks. So this is the phase that occurs in the mouth, right? So this phase, the buccal phase, is voluntary, all right? And this is where your tongue is going to move that bolus to the back of your mouth, all right? When it moves it to the back of the mouth, that bolus being there activates these tactile, that's just like touch sensitive receptors, right? They're activated by that food, that bolus touching them, all right? And that's going to initiate this process of swallowing. So the bolus physically being in the back of your mouth, right, moved there by the tongue, is going to initiate swallowing because of those tactile receptors. All right, and then we move to this pharyngeal phase. Okay, so the pharyngeal phase is involuntary. All right, and this is where that uvula, when you start to swallow, your uvula closes off the nasopharynx, and that epiglottis, right, is going to cover the larynx, right? So your larynx kind of moves up so that the epiglottis can kind of fold down and cover over the top of it. All right, in this phase also that upper esophageal sphincter will open so that the bolus can move through it. Okay, and then our last phase for swallowing is the esophageal phase. So this is where that bolus is moving through the esophagus. This is involuntary, and the bolus moves through the esophagus in about 8 seconds. It's very, very quick. All right, and so during this phase, that lower esophageal sphincter right here between the esophagus and the stomach is going to open, and the upper esophageal sphincter is going to close. All right, so this process of moving the food, the bolus through the esophagus, is going to be accomplished through peristalsis. All right, so this would be peristalsis. Okay. All right, and so then the last topic for the esophagus, there's a couple of disorders associated with the esophagus, particularly where the esophagus meets the stomach. And the first one is a hiatal hernia. All right, so a hiatal hernia occurs when the stomach actually protrudes above the diaphragm. Okay, and so this could happen for quite a few different reasons. You know, there are instances from birth where some individuals, this region of the diaphragm that's around the esophagus here is just a little looser than in other people, so it's easier for the stomach to possibly move above. All right. There can also be trauma that can kind of cause this to happen. Somebody who is dealing with severe vomiting, right, that can cause that stomach to protrude up above the diaphragm. It can be very dangerous, right, because it becomes a little easier for stomach acid to get up into the esophagus, all right. And also you don't want to really constrict, right, this little region of the stomach either, right, disconnect it from the rest of the stomach. Okay. All right. And so actually sometimes hiatal hernias, just depending on how severe they are, how much of the stomach has moved above the diaphragm, if it's not very severe, it can go completely undetected unless maybe the doctor is imaging for some other reason and then they notice it. All right. So, but more severe cases, you would see reflux problems and things like that. Okay. All right, and then GERD, all right, gastroesophageal reflux disorder. So that's GERD, occurs when stomach acid is able to backflow up into the esophagus. And so that can be very serious because the esophagus is not equipped to counteract that serious level of acid that's in the stomach, right? There's no enzymes there or buffers to deal with that acidity. And so that can end up causing ulcers, right, in the esophagus. It can cause inflammation of the esophagus, that's esophagitis. And if it's long-term, chronic, that could lead to esophageal cancer if you just keep damaging that tissue in the esophagus over and over. It can become cancerous. Okay? All right, so we're going to leave it there, and we'll pick up on the stomach in the next video.